The auction hammer fell at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and with it, the last thread connecting Jack Morrison to everything his grandfather had built snapped clean. Down to his final $1,200 after the bank seized his family's 200-acre cattle operation, Jack stood in the back of the county courthouse watching strangers bid on a derelict ranch property that even the most desperate land speculators wouldn't touch. What he found buried beneath that forsaken place would unravel a secret his grandfather had carried to the grave, one that would bring federal agents to his door before the week was out and force Jack to question everything he thought he knew about the man who raised him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jack Morrison had never imagined standing in a county auction room at 38 years old with nothing but pocket change and a decade of bad decisions behind him. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across rows of metal folding chairs where buyers sat with their paddles raised, their eyes fixed on properties they'd flip within the month. Jack kept his back against the wall, his calloused hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, feeling the weight of $1,200 bills folded against his thigh. Everything he had left in the world. 6 months earlier, he'd still been running Morrison Ranch, the cattle operation his grandfather built from dust and determination in 1962. 300 head of Black Angus, good grazing land along the Clearwater River, and a reputation for honest dealings that stretched across 3 counties. Then the drought hit hard, followed by a bacterial outbreak that took half the herd. The bank had been patient at first, but patience doesn't pay interest, and by winter they'd posted the foreclosure notice on the gate Jack's grandfather had welded with his own hands. The day they came to take possession, Jack had walked every acre of that land one last time. He'd touched the fence posts his grandfather had set, run his fingers along the barn beams they'd raised together when Jack was 16, stood in the empty pastures where generations of cattle had grazed. His grandfather, old Thomas Morrison, had died 5 years back, but Jack felt his presence strongest in those final hours, felt the weight of a legacy he'd failed to protect. Next item, the auctioneer's voice cut through Jack's thoughts. Lot 17, the Brennan Ranch property out on County Road 47. 160 acres with main house, barn, and outbuildings. Property's been vacant going on 12 years now. Seized for unpaid taxes. Selling as is, no warranties. Do I hear 5,000? The room stayed silent. Jack straightened slightly, paying attention now. He knew the Brennan place by reputation only. It sat in the hill country west of town, isolated and forgotten, the kind of property locals warned their kids away from with vague stories about the old man who'd lived there alone until he died. Gerald Brennan had been a recluse, they said. Paranoid. The kind of man who'd shoot first and ask questions never if you crossed his property line. 4,000? The auctioneer tried again, scanning the room with practiced efficiency. Nothing. 3,000? Jack pulled the folded bills from his pocket, his pulse quickening. The smart play would be to save what he had, find work somewhere, rebuild slowly. But Jack had learned long ago that safety nets were for people who hadn't already fallen. And something about that property, abandoned and unwanted, spoke to the hollowness in his chest where his own land used to be. 1,500, Jack heard himself say, his voice carrying across the near-empty room. The auctioneer's eyes found him in the back. I have 1,500. Do I hear 2,000? Silence stretched out. A woman in the front row turned to look at Jack, her expression a mixture of pity and confusion. Everyone knew what happened to Morrison Ranch. Everyone knew Jack had nothing left. Going once at 1,500, the auctioneer continued. Going twice. Jack's heart hammered. This was insane. He didn't even know what condition the buildings were in, whether the land could support cattle, whether there was water or power or anything worth the gamble. Sold to bidder 41 for $1,500. The hammer fell again, and Jack stood frozen, unable to believe what he'd just done. Around him, people were gathering their things, moving toward the clerk's window to finalize purchases. Jack forced his legs to move, walking down the aisle toward the front desk where a tired-looking woman was already pulling up the property file on her computer. "Congratulations," she said without enthusiasm as Jack approached. "You just bought yourself a piece of history. The Brennan Ranch. Haven't had anyone willing to touch that place in over a decade." Jack counted out $1,500 bills onto the counter, leaving exactly $300 to his name. "What's wrong with it?" The clerk printed out paperwork, stamping each page with mechanical precision. "Nothing legally. Structures are standing, land surveyed and clear. It's just got a reputation, is all. Gerald Brennan who owned it, he was military back in the day. Came home from overseas and built that place up like a fortress. Never let anyone on the property, never came to town except for supplies. When he died in 2012, took them 3 weeks to even find the body." She slid the deed across the counter. "There were rumors, of course. Folks said he was storing weapons out there, or running some kind of illegal operation. Sheriff searched the place after he died, didn't find anything except a paranoid old man's collection of locks and security systems. Property went to probate, then to the state when no heirs came forward. Been sitting empty ever since, gathering stories. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Jack signed where she indicated, his hand steady despite the chaos in his mind. "Anyone else bid on it? Before today?" "Not in the 3 years it's been on the auction list. Most folks around here won't go near it. Say the place has bad energy, whatever that means." She handed him a key ring with several old keys attached. "Well, it's yours now. Good luck with it." Outside the courthouse, Jack sat in his truck, a 1987 Ford F-250 with 200,000 miles and a transmission that ground on every gear change. The deed sat on the passenger seat next to him, official and irreversible. He'd just spent most of his remaining money on a property he'd never even seen based on nothing but desperation and instinct. The rational part of his brain screamed that he'd made a catastrophic mistake. The deeper part, the part that still heard his grandfather's voice in quiet moments, whispered something different. Sometimes the only way forward is through the places no one else will go. Jack started the truck and pulled out of the parking lot, heading west toward County Road 47. The afternoon sun hung low on the horizon, painting the grasslands in shades of amber and rust. He'd grown up in this country, knew every back road and creek bed, but the area where the Brennan Ranch sat was territory he'd rarely traveled. Too isolated, too far from main roads, the kind of land that swallowed men whole if they weren't careful. 40 minutes of driving brought him to a turnoff marked only by a weathered post leaning at an angle. No sign, no mailbox, just a dirt road disappearing into scrub oak and cedar. Jack shifted into 4-wheel drive and started down the rutted track, branches scraping against the truck sides. The road wound through increasingly rough terrain for nearly 2 miles before opening into a clearing. Jack stopped the truck, his breath catching in his throat. Before him stood the remains of someone's dream gone to seed. A 2-story ranch house, once white but now weathered to the color of old bone, dominated the property. Its wraparound porch sagged on one side, and several windows were either broken or boarded over. But the structure stood solid, its bones good beneath the years of neglect. Behind the house, a massive barn rose against the darkening sky, its red paint faded to rust but its frame still square and true. Smaller outbuildings scattered across the property, a workshop, a storage shed, what might have been a bunkhouse at one time. Everywhere Jack looked, he saw evidence of Gerald Brennan's obsessive security. High fences topped with barbed wire, heavy chains on every door, metal shutters mounted beside windows. Jack climbed out of the truck, his boots crunching on gravel as he approached the house. The evening air carried the scent of cedar and dust, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. The property felt abandoned but not empty, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. The front door resisted his first attempt with the key, the lock seized from years of disuse. Jack worked it patiently, and finally, the mechanism gave way with a grinding click. The door swung inward, hinges screaming, revealing a darkness that smelled of mildew and time. Jack pulled a flashlight from his pocket and stepped inside. The beam cut through shadows, illuminating a front room that looked like it had been abandoned mid-routine. Furniture covered in dust sheets, a coat rack by the door with a faded jacket still hanging, boots lined up neatly against the wall. Gerald Brennan had been a man of military precision, that much was clear. Everything had its place, even in death. Moving deeper into the house, Jack catalogued what he saw. A kitchen with ancient appliances but solid cabinetry. A dining room with a heavy oak table. A study lined with empty bookshelves. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms and a bathroom with fixtures from the 1970s. Throughout it all, signs of Brennan's paranoia, multiple locks on every exterior door, bars on windows, a panel beside the front door that had once controlled some kind of security system. As he descended the stairs back to the first floor, Jack noticed something he'd missed in his initial walkthrough. In the kitchen, partially hidden behind a freestanding pantry, was another door. Heavy, reinforced, with 3 separate deadbolts. A basement entrance, he realized, though he hadn't seen any mention of a basement in the property description. The keys from the clerk's office included several he hadn't yet identified. Jack tried them one by one in the basement door's locks. The 3rd key worked in the top deadbolt, but the other 2 locks wouldn't budge. He'd need bolt cutters or a locksmith. The realization that he couldn't afford either stung, but Jack had learned to be resourceful in lean times. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he'd find a way. Tonight, he needed to assess whether the property was even habitable. Jack spent the next hour checking basics. The well pump was dead, but the well itself appeared intact. The electrical panel showed the power had been disconnected years ago. The roof leaked in 2 places upstairs but was otherwise sound. All fixable, given time and money he didn't have. As darkness fell completely, Jack sat on the sagging front porch, looking out over land that was now his. 160 acres of hill country, untouched and unknown. He thought about his grandfather, about the Morrison ranch now owned by strangers, about the long chain of decisions that had led him to this moment. "What would you do, old man?" Jack said aloud to the empty night. "Would you tell me I'm a fool? Or would you understand?" The wind through the cedar trees provided no answer, but Jack felt a strange sense of rightness settle over him. This place, broken and forgotten as it was, felt like his last chance. Not to rebuild what he'd lost, but to build something new from the wreckage. He spent the night in his truck, too tired to drive back to town and too weary to sleep in the house without proper inspection. Dreams came fitfully, filled with images of locked doors and his grandfather's weathered hands working fence wire, showing a teenage Jack how to splice and tighten, how to build something that would last. Dawn broke cold and clear, painting the ranch in shades of gold. Jack woke stiff and sore, his breath misting in the cab. He had $300 left, a truck that wouldn't last another year, and a property that needed tens of thousands in repairs. The smart thing would be to sell it immediately, take whatever profit he could and move on. Instead, Jack grabbed his toolbox from the truck bed and walked to the barn. If he was going to make this work, he needed to know what he had to work with. The barn doors hung on massive hinges, secured with a chain and padlock that took him 20 minutes to cut through with a hacksaw. When the chain finally parted, Jack pulled the doors open, flooding the interior with morning light. What he found inside made him stop and stare. The barn wasn't just a barn. It was a workshop, a garage, a storage facility, and something else he couldn't quite define. Shelves lined the walls, holding tools in meticulous organization. A workbench ran the length of one side, its surface clean despite years of dust. But what caught Jack's attention was the equipment. Generators, water filtration systems, communications gear that looked military-grade. Gerald Brennan hadn't just been preparing for emergencies. He'd been preparing for the end of the world. And in the far corner of the barn, partially concealed behind stacked containers, Jack spotted something that made his pulse quicken. Another door, this one reinforced metal, built into what appeared to be a concrete structure extending into the ground. Not just a storm shelter. Something more deliberate. More permanent. Jack approached slowly, his mind racing. The door had a modern keypad lock, the kind that required a code. He tried the handle anyway, not expecting anything. To his shock, it turned. The electronic lock was dead, its battery long since drained, and the manual override had been left disengaged. The door swung open, revealing stairs descending into darkness. Cool air wafted up, carrying a metallic scent that Jack couldn't identify. He shined his flashlight down, the beam illuminating concrete steps leading to what appeared to be an underground room. Every instinct told Jack to stop, to call the sheriff, to handle this properly. But the same instinct that had made him bid on this property drove him forward. He descended the stairs carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. At the bottom, his flashlight revealed a space that defied everything he'd expected. It wasn't a bunker. It was a vault. The room, approximately 20 feet square, had been built with the same precision as a bank safe. Reinforced concrete walls, a ventilation system still humming faintly on backup power, and along one wall, a massive steel safe that stood nearly 6 feet tall. But it was what sat on the table in the center of the room that stopped Jack cold. Stacks of documents, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Photographs showing land surveys, geological reports, and something else, maps marked with symbols and notations Jack didn't recognize. And on top of it all, a leather journal with a name embossed on the cover, Thomas Morrison. Jack's hands trembled as he picked up the journal, his grandfather's name seeming to burn through the leather into his palms. He opened it to the first page, and in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting, read words that would change everything he thought he knew about his family's history. If you're reading this, it means I failed to tell you myself. Forgive me, Jack. Some secrets are too dangerous to speak aloud. Jack stood in the underground vault, his grandfather's journal trembling in his hands as he read words that seemed to reach across death itself. The flashlight beam wavered, casting moving shadows across the concrete walls while his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Thomas Morrison, the man who'd raised him after his parents died, the man who'd taught him everything about working land and keeping your word, had been connected to Gerald Brennan. Connected in ways that went far deeper than Jack had ever imagined. He turned the page, his grandfather's precise handwriting filling the yellowed paper with confessions that felt like betrayals and explanations all at once. Gerald and I served together in Vietnam, 1968 to 1970. What we saw there, what we were ordered to do, it changed us both. But what we found in those jungle highlands changed everything we thought we knew about what was possible in this world. Jack's legs felt weak. He lowered himself onto the metal chair beside the table, never taking his eyes from the journal. His grandfather had rarely spoken about the war, just brief mentions of serving his country and coming home grateful to work clean soil under open sky. Nothing about finding anything, about secrets that would require a vault buried beneath a paranoid man's ranch. The journal continued in fragments, each entry dated years apart. 1975, Gerald bought the land today. I helped him choose it. The geological surveys match what we documented overseas. If we're right, this region sits on similar fault lines, similar mineral compositions. Gerald thinks they'll come here eventually. I think he's lost his mind to fear, but I owe him my life 3 times over, so I'll help him prepare. Jack flipped forward, scanning entries from the 1980s. His grandfather's tone shifted from skepticism to concern to something that looked like reluctant belief. 1983, Gerald showed me the first samples today. I don't know how he acquired them or what they mean, but the spectral analysis is unlike anything in known geology. He's convinced this proves his theory. I'm convinced it proves we're both too old to know what we're looking at anymore. The photographs spread across the table made more sense now, though the sense they made defied reason. Aerial surveys of this property and Morrison Ranch, marked with coordinates and notations. Soil samples with chemical breakdowns that Jack's limited knowledge of geology couldn't interpret. And stranger still, images that looked like they'd been taken through telescopes or high-powered cameras, showing lights in the night sky that didn't move like aircraft or satellites. Jack set down the journal and moved to the massive safe against the wall. It had a combination lock, old-fashioned and mechanical. He tried his grandfather's birthday, the anniversary of Morrison Ranch's founding, his own birthday. Nothing. Then, almost on instinct, he tried a number his grandfather had repeated throughout his childhood whenever teaching Jack about honest dealing: October 15, 62. The date Thomas Morrison had purchased his first acre of land. The safe's lock clicked. The heavy door swung open with a whisper of well-maintained hinges. Inside, Jack found what Gerald Brennan had spent his life protecting and what his grandfather had helped hide. Metal containers, each labeled with dates and coordinates. Jack opened the nearest one with hands that had started to shake. Inside, nestled in protective foam, were fragments of something that looked like metal but felt wrong in his hands. Too light, too warm, with a surface that seemed to shift colors in the flashlight beam. Black to deep blue to something close to purple, depending on the angle. A manila envelope in the safe contained more documents. Official military reports stamped with classifications Jack recognized from movies but had never seen in real life. Incident reports from 1969, describing an aircraft crash in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. But the aircraft described didn't match any military hardware Jack had ever heard of. No wings, no engine signature, no identifiable origin. Just wreckage that had appeared after witnesses reported seeing lights in the sky. The report detailed recovery operations led by a special unit. Gerald Brennan and Thomas Morrison were both listed in the personnel roster. The wreckage had been collected, analyzed at a field laboratory, and then, according to the final page, lost during an attack on the base camp. All physical evidence destroyed. All documentation classified and sealed. The matter closed. Except it hadn't been closed. Somehow, Gerald and Thomas had kept samples. Had hidden them, brought them home, and spent the next 40 years studying them in secret while building lives that looked ordinary from the outside. Jack sat back, trying to reconcile this revelation with the man he'd known. His grandfather had been solid, dependable, the kind of man who believed in hard work and straight dealing. Not the kind to steal military property and maintain a decades-long cover-up. But the evidence surrounded him, undeniable and strange. The journal had more entries, spanning into the early 2000s. 2003, Gerald's convinced they're monitoring this area. He's installed more security systems, more cameras. I tell him he's paranoid, but privately I wonder if he's right. There have been lights over my property too. Things Emma saw as a child that I told her were planes or satellites. Maybe I was lying to her. Maybe I was lying to myself. Emma. Jack's mother. Dead now 15 years from cancer, but alive in these pages as a witness to something her father had dismissed. Jack remembered her stories from when he was young, how she'd talk about seeing strange lights dancing over Morrison Ranch when she was a girl, how Grandpa Thomas would smile and tell her they were just watching over them. Jack had always assumed it was a game they played, a way to make the isolated ranch feel less lonely. Now he wondered what his mother had actually seen and what his grandfather had actually known. A sound from above froze Jack's thoughts. Footsteps crossing the barn floor, heavy and deliberate. Multiple sets. Jack killed his flashlight and stood silently in the darkness of the vault, his heart hammering. No one knew he was here. No one except the county clerk, and she hadn't seemed like the type to spread gossip about auction purchases. Voices filtered down through the barn's floor. Male, authoritative, using words Jack couldn't quite make out but recognized the tone of. Official business. Questions being asked. He'd heard that tone before, from bank officers who'd come to discuss his foreclosure, from county officials who'd overseen the seizure of Morrison Ranch. Jack moved quietly to the stairs, straining to hear. Property transfer was flagged in the system yesterday, one voice said. Morrison, Jack Morrison. That name rang bells, so I did some checking. His grandfather was Thomas Morrison, flagged in our database from 1969. 43 years ago, another voice responded. Think it's connected? Thomas Morrison purchased land 18 miles east of here. Morrison Ranch, foreclosed on 6 months back. Now his grandson buys this property? The Brennan Ranch? That's not coincidence, that's pattern. Jack's blood went cold. Whoever these men were, they knew about his grandfather's connection to Gerald Brennan. They'd been watching, waiting, for something exactly like this to happen. His purchase of the property had triggered alarms and systems he didn't know existed. "Search the premises thoroughly," the first voice commanded. "If Brennan left anything behind, if Morrison's grandson found anything, I want to know about it. And find Morrison. He's here somewhere." His truck's parked out front and still warm. Jack had seconds to decide. He could reveal himself, cooperate, and hope these men were legitimate federal agents rather than something else. Or he could hide, protect what his grandfather and Gerald Brennan had died keeping secret, and figure out what was really happening before exposing himself. The journal made his decision. In the margins of one of the later entries, his grandfather had written in urgent script, "If they ever come asking, Jack, remember what I taught you. The land protects those who respect it. Trust the soil before you trust uniforms." Jack gathered the journal, the photographs, and 2 of the metal containers from the safe. He couldn't take everything, but he could take enough to understand what this was really about. Moving as silently as his work boots allowed, he climbed back up the stairs and eased the vault door closed behind him. The barn had a back exit, a loading door that faced the tree line. If he could reach it before they searched this far, he might make it to the woods. The barn's interior offered dozens of hiding spots between stacked equipment and stored materials, but hiding would only delay the inevitable. Jack moved low and fast, using the workbench's cover while he crossed toward the back wall. Through gaps in the barn's siding, he could see 2 black SUVs parked beside his truck. 4 men visible, which meant at least 2 more he couldn't account for. He'd almost reached the loading door when a voice called out from the front of the barn. "I've got fresh footprints here. Recent. He's been inside." Jack didn't wait. He threw open the loading door and ran for the tree line, the pack containing his grandfather's secrets bouncing against his back. Shouts erupted behind him, orders being barked, but Jack had grown up in country like this. Had spent his youth hunting these hills, learning every draw and hollow. If he could reach the woods, he had a chance. The first shot cracked overhead, splintering bark from a cedar tree 3 feet to his right. Jack's mind went blank with primal fear even as his body kept moving, weaving between trees, using terrain he was learning by instinct. They were shooting at him. Federal agents didn't shoot at unarmed civilians for running. Which meant these men weren't what they claimed to be, or what they were protecting was worth more than one rancher's life. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs screamed, until the sounds of pursuit faded behind him. The woods here were thick, cut through with ravines and rocky outcrops that made tracking difficult. Jack found a dense cedar brake and crawled deep into its shadows, pressing himself against the cold ground while he tried to control his ragged breathing. Time passed in strange increments, measured by his heartbeat and the filtered sunlight moving across the forest floor. Eventually, he heard vehicles starting, driving away. But Jack didn't move. He'd learned patience from years of working cattle, learned that rushing often cost more than waiting. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Jack finally allowed himself to think about what had just happened. He'd bought a property and within 24 hours, armed men were searching it and shooting at him when he ran. Men who knew his grandfather's name, who'd been monitoring for exactly this kind of property transfer. Whatever Gerald Brennan and Thomas Morrison had hidden, it was still valuable enough, still dangerous enough, to warrant this kind of response decades later. Jack opened his pack and carefully examined what he'd taken. The metal fragments still felt wrong in his hands, neither hot nor cold but somehow both. The journal's later entries were increasingly urgent, his grandfather's handwriting less precise, as if written in haste or fear. One entry from 2017, less than a year before Thomas Morrison's death, stood out. "Gerald is gone. They're calling it natural causes, but I know better. He contacted someone he shouldn't have, tried to bring an outside analysis of the samples. Now he's dead and his property will go to auction eventually. I need to make sure the right person finds what we've protected. Someone who'll understand why we did this. Someone who won't let them bury the truth again. The right person." Had his grandfather orchestrated this somehow? Ensured the property would languish unnoticed until Jack, desperate and broken, would be in the exact position to bid on it. The timing felt too precise to be coincidence. The bank had taken Morrison Ranch. Jack had lost everything. And suddenly, an untouchable property came up for auction at a price Jack could barely afford. His grandfather had always said the land had a way of choosing its people, not the other way around. Jack had thought it was just poetic talk from an old rancher. Now he wondered if Thomas Morrison had known exactly what he was doing, had set in motion a plan that would unfold years after his death. As darkness fell, Jack made his way carefully back toward the property, circling wide to approach from the south. The SUVs were gone, but his truck remained where he'd left it. They'd searched it, his toolbox dumped in the dirt, his glove compartment torn open. But they'd left it, which meant they were hoping he'd come back. Hoping he'd lead them to whatever he'd taken. Jack didn't go to his truck. Instead, he moved to the house, entering through a window he'd noticed was loose during his initial inspection. Inside, the house had been thoroughly searched. Every drawer dumped, every closet emptied, furniture overturned. They'd been looking for something specific and hadn't found it. In the kitchen, Jack found the reinforced basement door still locked, though scratched around the deadbolts where someone had tried to force entry. They hadn't gotten through. Whatever else was down there remained hidden. But Jack couldn't risk going down now, not with the possibility of surveillance cameras or motion sensors they might have installed. He needed help. He needed someone who could tell him what these metal fragments were, who could explain his grandfather's cryptic warnings, who could help him understand what Gerald Brennan had died protecting. But who could he trust? The sheriff? The same county officials who'd overseen his ranch's foreclosure? Federal authorities who might be the very people searching for him? The answer came from an unlikely memory. His grandfather talking about an old army buddy who'd gone on to teach geology at the state university. Professor Marcus Webb, who'd visited Morrison Ranch once when Jack was a teenager. Who'd spent hours in his grandfather's study talking about formations and mineral compositions in words Jack hadn't understood then. Jack found a phone book in the ransacked kitchen, remarkably still intact. The university's main number was listed, but he couldn't call from here, couldn't risk the line being monitored. He needed to get to town, to a payphone if any still existed, or to the library where he could use their computers without creating a direct connection to himself. But first, he needed to secure what he'd taken. Jack couldn't keep the samples and journal with him if he was being tracked. The property itself was compromised. Which left only one option, the one place these men wouldn't think to look because it was already lost to him. Morrison Ranch. His family's land, now owned by an agricultural corporation from 3 states away. But Jack knew that land like he knew his own heartbeat, knew places on those 200 acres where a man could hide something and nature would keep the secret. He waited until well after midnight before moving to his truck. It started on the 3rd try, the engine's familiar rumble sounding too loud in the stillness. Jack didn't use his headlights, navigating by moonlight and memory down the rough track that led away from Brennan Ranch. If they were watching, if they'd left someone behind, he'd know soon enough. No one followed. The road stayed empty behind him, and after 20 minutes of careful driving, Jack allowed himself to breathe. He knew these back roads, knew which ones led away from main highways and through country too rough for easy pursuit. By dawn, he'd reached the southern border of what used to be Morrison Ranch, parking his truck in a grove of live oaks a quarter mile from the actual property line. He hiked in on foot, carrying the pack with his grandfather's secrets. The land rose to meet him with familiar contours, every fence line and dry creek bed a memory. This was the northwest pasture where he'd found his first calf born during his watch. This was the ridge where his grandfather had taught him to read weather in the clouds. This was home, even though it belonged to strangers now. Jack found the old line shack near dawn, a small stone building his grandfather had built in the 1970s for storing salt licks and tools during winter feeding. The corporation hadn't torn it down yet, probably hadn't even noticed it existed. Inside, the air smelled of dust and abandonment, but the stone walls stood solid. He pried up a floor stone in the back corner, revealing a hollow space his grandfather had shown him once for storing emergency supplies. Just in case, Jack, Thomas Morrison had said. A man needs to know his land as places the world can't reach. Jack placed the metal containers and journal in the hollow, wrapped in waterproof plastic. He'd come back for them once he understood what he was protecting and who he was protecting it from. For now, they'd rest in soil that had been Morrison land for over 50 years, protected by granite and memory. As he replaced the stone, Jack heard vehicles approaching. Multiple engines, moving fast across open pasture. They tracked him somehow, followed him despite his precautions. Or maybe they'd simply guessed, understood that a man losing everything would return to the place he'd lost it. Jack ran from the line shack toward the creek bed, knowing he had minutes at best. Behind him, shouts rang out, orders being given. But this was his land, would always be his land in ways that couldn't be signed away in foreclosure documents. He reached the creek and followed it downstream, using the water to break his scent trail, using overhanging branches to mask his passage. The land protected him, just as his grandfather had promised it would. By the time the sun fully rose, Jack had put 3 miles between himself and his pursuers, emerging from the creek near a county road he recognized. His truck was gone, certainly surrounded by now. His property was compromised. His past was weaponized against him. But he had questions that needed answers, and somewhere out there, Professor Marcus Webb might provide them. If Jack could reach him. If Webb could be trusted. If any of this made sense beyond the desperate gamble of a man with $300 in secrets he didn't understand, running from forces he couldn't name across land that remembered his grandfather's footsteps and wouldn't forget his own. Jack stood outside the university's geology building 3 days later, looking nothing like a man who belonged there. His clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in his truck at rest stops, his face unshaven, his eyes carrying the weight of constant vigilance. He'd driven in circles across 2 states, switching vehicles twice by borrowing from old ranching friends who asked no questions when he showed up requesting help. The truck that had carried him from county auctions to midnight escapes now sat abandoned behind a feed store in Nebraska, replaced by a faded Chevy that rattled but ran. Professor Marcus Webb's office was on the 3rd floor, according to the directory in the lobby. Jack took the stairs, avoiding cameras in the elevator, still operating on the assumption that someone was looking for him. The hallway smelled of old books and floor wax, lined with doors bearing names of faculty he didn't know. Webb's door stood half open, revealing an office crammed with rock specimens, geological maps, and precarious stacks of research papers. The man behind the desk looked older than Jack remembered, his hair fully white now, his face deeply lined. But when Webb glanced up at the knock and saw Jack standing in the doorway, recognition flickered immediately across his features. Not just recognition of who Jack was, but recognition of why he'd come. As if Webb had been expecting this visit for years. "Jack Morrison," Webb said quietly, setting down the paper he'd been reading. "You have your grandfather's eyes. And his timing. Come in and close the door." Jack did, his hand instinctively moving to the backpack he'd retrieved from the line shack that morning under cover of darkness. Inside were the metal fragments, the journal, and questions that had multiplied with each mile he'd driven. Webb watched him with an expression that mixed sadness and resignation. "He told you I'd come," Jack said. "It wasn't a question." "Thomas made me promise something 15 years ago," Webb replied, standing to pull blinds closed over his office window. "He said if you ever showed up here with questions about Gerald Brennan, I was to give you the truth. All of it. Even the parts that would make me lose my tenure, my reputation, everything I've built." He smiled without humor. "I told him that was asking a lot. He said you'd be asking more by coming here at all." Jack set the backpack on Webb's desk and carefully removed one of the metal containers. Webb's breath caught when he saw it, his hand reaching out then stopping, hovering in the air as if afraid to make contact. He kept samples. God help us both, he actually kept them. "What are they?" Jack asked, opening the container to reveal the strange fragments inside. Webb sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every year of his age. "Proof that everything we think we know about our place in the universe is provincial and small. Your grandfather and Gerald Brennan found these in Vietnam in 1969. They were part of a recovery operation for what the military publicly denied ever happened and privately classified so deep that most presidents probably don't know the files exist. He reached for the fragment, this time completing the motion, lifting it with reverent care. The material composition defies terrestrial geology. Alloys that shouldn't exist, molecular structures that can't form under Earth conditions, properties that violate our understanding of metallurgy. I analyzed a sample Thomas brought me in 2003. Spent months on it, lost sleep, questioned my sanity. The conclusion was inescapable. This didn't come from air. Jack sat down heavily in the chair across from Webb's desk. My grandfather knew this whole time. Lived with it, farmed his land, raised cattle, taught me about honest work and keeping your word, all while hiding proof of extraterrestrial contact. He did more than hide it, Webb said. He and Gerald spent decades documenting patterns, collecting evidence, trying to understand not just where these objects came from, but why they kept appearing in specific locations. Including the land your grandfather owned. Including the property Gerald purchased. Webb stood and moved to a filing cabinet, retrieving a folder thick with papers. Thomas sent me observations for over 30 years. Lights in the sky, electromagnetic anomalies, geological formations that showed signs of exposure to extreme heat or energy. He was meticulous, scientific in his approach, even though he knew no mainstream institution would touch his findings. Why? Jack asked. Why spend his whole life on this if he knew no one would believe him? Because he thought it mattered, Webb said simply. Because whatever intelligence was visiting those areas was showing particular interest in the land itself. The soil, the mineral deposits, the aquifers. Thomas became convinced they were studying us, yes, but also helping us. Enriching the soil, purifying water sources, doing things that benefited anyone who worked that land. Jack thought about Morrison Ranch, about harvests that always seemed to exceed projections, about cattle that thrived when neighboring ranches struggled. Things he'd attributed to his grandfather's skill, his knowledge of the land. He never took credit. Never told anyone. He couldn't, Webb replied. The men who secured that crash site in Vietnam, they were threatened into silence. Official channels were closed. But Thomas and Gerald, they refused to let the truth be completely buried. So they protected it their way, in the soil they worked, in properties they could control. Jack pulled out his grandfather's journal and opened it to the final entries. He wrote that Gerald died because he tried to bring an outside analysis. That they killed him to keep the secret buried. Who are they, Professor? Who am I running from? Webb's face darkened. Private military contractors, intelligence operatives, corporate interests who've monetized recovered technology. The official government barely knows half of what's happening, and what they do know, they can't control. It's become an underground industry, Jack. Recovering artifacts, reverse engineering technology, eliminating anyone who threatens the monopoly on that knowledge. Gerald threatened that monopoly, Jack said, understanding now. And then his property went to auction. And I bought it. Which means I threatened it too. You did more than that, Webb said, leaning forward. You're Thomas Morrison's grandson. You inherited his ranch before losing it, which means you have legitimate claim to anything found on that property during your ownership. And you purchased the Brennan Ranch, which gives you rights to anything discovered there. Legally, you're entitled to these samples. You're entitled to the documentation. They can't simply take it from you without exposing the entire operation to legal scrutiny they can't afford. The implications settled over Jack like dawn breaking. That's why they shot at me instead of arresting me. That's why they searched but didn't seize. They have no legal standing, no authority to act openly. Exactly, Webb confirmed. But that also means you're in extraordinary danger. If they can't take this from you legally, they'll do it another way. You can't go home, Jack. You can't access your bank accounts, contact old friends, anything that creates a trail back to you. Jack thought about the $300 in his pocket, the borrowed truck outside, the life he'd already lost to foreclosure now compounded by exile. My grandfather planned this. He knew I'd lose the ranch. Knew I'd be desperate enough to buy worthless property. Knew I'd find what he'd hidden and come to you. Thomas was dying when he told me about his plan, Webb said quietly. Cancer, though he wouldn't let them treat it. Said he'd lived his life and made his choices, and now he needed to make sure you'd have a choice of your own. He could have destroyed the samples, burned the documentation, let the secret die with him and Gerald. Instead, he gave you the truth and trusted you to decide what to do with it. Jack stood and walked to the window, looking out over the campus where students moved between buildings, living ordinary lives with ordinary concerns. What can I do with it? If I go public, they'll discredit me. If I try to sell it, they'll kill me. If I keep running, I'll never have a life. There's another option, Webb said. One your grandfather and I discussed. It requires trust, patience, and faith that the land itself has memory longer than corporate interests have power. He explained his plan slowly, carefully, and Jack listened with growing understanding. It wasn't victory in any traditional sense. It was something older, something his grandfather would have understood. The kind of patience you learn from working soil that had been worked for generations, from building fences that would outlast your own life, from planting trees whose shade you'd never sit in. 2 weeks later, Jack stood at the southern boundary of Morrison Ranch under cover of darkness, the backpack once again heavy with his grandfather's secrets. The agricultural corporation that owned the land now ran it with efficiency and profit margins, their focus on quarterly returns and yield optimization. They didn't know the land the way Jack did, didn't understand its contours and memories. Didn't know about the places where bedrock rose close to the surface, creating natural vaults that would remain undisturbed unless you knew exactly where to look. Jack found the spot by counting paces from landmarks only he remembered. A lightning-struck oak. A distinctive rock formation. The place where the creek bent around an outcrop of limestone. Here, his grandfather had once shown him how water carved channels through stone over centuries, how patience and persistence could reshape the hardest materials. Using tools he'd bought with the last of his money, Jack cut through sod and dug down to the limestone shelf. He worked quickly but carefully, creating a cavity just large enough for the metal containers. He placed them with reverence, these fragments that had traveled unimaginable distances only to be hidden in Texas soil by men who understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to expose but too important to lose. The journal went in with them, his grandfather's handwriting preserved in waterproof wrapping. Future generations might find these things when the corporate owners finally sold the land, when it changed hands again and again until someone with eyes to see and patience to understand came along. Or maybe the land itself would reveal them when the time was right, the way it had revealed itself to Thomas Morrison, to Gerald Brennan, to Jack himself. He covered the cavity and replaced the sod, working the soil with his hands until no trace of disturbance remained. The land accepted its burden without complaint, as it always had. As it always would. When he finished, Jack sat on the limestone outcrop and watched the sun rise over land that had been his family's for 3 generations and would never be his again in any legal sense. But sitting there, feeling the stone beneath him and the soil's weight in his fingernails, he understood what his grandfather had been trying to teach him all along. Ownership was paper and banks and foreclosure notices. Belonging was something else entirely. It was written in the body's memory of working this ground, in the knowledge of where water ran underground and which draws flooded in heavy rain. In the understanding that land kept its own records, remembered its own people, regardless of whose name appeared on deeds. Professor Webb's plan was simple in concept, difficult in execution. Jack would disappear, not as a fugitive but as a ghost. He'd take a job on a ranch in Montana under a slightly different name, working cattle for a man Webb knew who didn't ask questions about a cowhand's past. He'd live small, move carefully, and wait. Wait for the corporate interests chasing him to turn their attention to other threats. Wait for the legal landscape to shift. Wait for the right moment to emerge with his story, backed by scientists Webb had been carefully assembling, a network of academics who'd sacrificed too much to keep silent forever. It might take years. It might take decades. But Jack had learned patience from a grandfather who'd carried secrets for 40 years, who'd built a life that looked simple from the outside while protecting truths that could reshape human understanding. If Thomas Morrison could work his land each day knowing what he knew, raising a grandson and running cattle while lights danced in his night skies, then Jack could wait too. Before leaving, Jack visited the old line shack one final time. The stone building stood solid, unchanged by transfers of ownership or corporate efficiency plans. Inside, he carved words into the wooden door frame with his pocket knife, placing them high where they'd be preserved by the overhang but visible to anyone who knew to look. The land remembers. Thomas Morrison, 1947 to 2018. Gerald Brennan, 1946 to 2017. Jack Morrison, 1985. He left the date of his death blank, a promise and a threat. He wasn't dead, wasn't finished, wasn't beaten. He was just waiting, the way his grandfather had taught him to wait when working cattle in drought years. You don't fight the land's rhythms. You don't demand what it can't give. You work with what's possible and trust that seasons change, that rain eventually falls, that patience outlasts almost anything except the land itself. Jack drove away from Morrison Ranch as dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose. In his rearview mirror, the land stretched out behind him, holding secrets in its soil and promises in its stone. His truck, the borrowed Chevy that had carried him through 3 states in 2 weeks of hiding, turned north toward a future he couldn't yet see clearly but could feel taking shape with each mile. The metal fragments rested in their limestone vault, protected by nothing but dirt and distance and the faith that truth, like water, eventually found its way to the surface. His grandfather's journal lay beside them, a testament written in steady handwriting by a man who'd known when to speak and when to wait. And somewhere in the network Professor Webb was building, scientists and researchers were slowly, carefully, building a case that might someday breach the walls of silence corporate interests had constructed. It wasn't the ending Jack had imagined when he'd stood in that auction room with $1,200 in desperation. He thought he was buying shelter, a place to start over. Instead, he'd inherited a legacy that stretched back to jungle highlands in 1969, forward to a future he might not live to see, and deep into the land that had chosen his family and held their secrets with the patience only soil possessed. Montana waited, offering work in anonymity. The ranch Webb had connected him with sat in the shadow of the Absaroka Range, working country where a man could lose himself in honest labor and find himself in the rhythm of seasons. Jack would rise before dawn to check cattle, mend fences under wide skies, and sleep in a small room that belonged to no one and asked nothing. He'd send no letters, make no calls, leave no trail that led back to the name Jack Morrison or the properties he'd lost. But on clear nights, when work was done and the world was quiet, he'd look up at the stars and remember his grandfather doing the same above Morrison Ranch. Remember Gerald Brennan watching from his fortress property with paranoia born from knowledge most people would never bear. Remember that some men chose to protect truths rather than profit from them, chose to plant seeds they'd never harvest, build futures they'd never inhabit. The land remembered. It would hold what he'd given it, would keep faith with the men who'd worked it and the boy who'd learned its lessons. And someday, when corporations had moved on and contractors had found other secrets to chase, when the time was finally right, Jack Morrison would return. Not to reclaim property or demand justice, but to witness the land giving back what it had been trusted to protect. Until then, he had cattle to work and seasons to weather, patience to practice and faith to keep. His grandfather had managed it for 40 years. Jack figured he could manage it too. After all, Morrison blood ran deep as water tables, stubborn as bedrock, patient as soil waiting for rain. The land had taught them that. The land would prove them right. The highway stretched north under a sky so vast it made human concerns feel appropriately small. Jack drove toward his exile with his grandfather's voice in his memory, speaking words from a childhood lesson about working ground after drought. The land gives what the land gives, Jack. Your job isn't to demand more. It's to be ready when abundance comes, and faithful when it doesn't. That's what makes a rancher. That's what makes a man. Jack was ready. Ready to wait, ready to work, ready to trust that the seeds his grandfather had planted in him would bear fruit in their own time. The Chevy's engine hummed steady beneath him. The road rolled on. And behind him, hidden in limestone and soil, the truth rested patient as earth itself, waiting for the day when the land would finally speak its secrets aloud. 7 years passed like water wearing stone, slowly reshaping everything while seeming to change nothing at all. Jack Morrison became Jake Morris in the employment records of the Sweetgrass Ranch outside of Livingston, Montana, a competent cowhand who kept to himself and did twice the work of men half his age. He rose before dawn to check cattle in winter storms, mended miles of fence under summer sun, and asked for nothing beyond honest pay and a quiet place to sleep. The ranch owner, a widow named Catherine Holder who'd inherited the operation from her husband, never questioned the past Jake Morris didn't talk about. She'd seen enough men running from something to recognize the look, and she'd learned that the best cowhands often carried histories they'd rather leave unspoken. What mattered was the work, and Jake Morris worked like a man trying to outrun ghosts or earn redemption. She was never quite sure which. In those 7 years, Jack learned a different kind of patience than his grandfather had taught him. Thomas Morrison's patience had been rooted in land he owned, in legacy he was building, in a future he could see taking shape through his grandson's growth. Jack's patience was untethered, floating, the patience of a man who'd surrendered control and learned to trust in time itself rather than any plan he could make. He followed news when he could, careful never to search his own name or anything connected to the Brennan Ranch. Professor Webb sent messages occasionally through elaborate chains of intermediaries, updates couched in language that sounded like discussions of geological formations but carried real meaning for those who knew how to read between words. The network was growing. Scientists were publishing papers that danced around the truth without quite speaking it. The walls of silence were developing cracks. But it was a message that came in the spring of Jack's 7th year in Montana that changed everything. Catherine found him in the north pasture replacing rotted fence posts and said simply, "There's a call for you at the house. Man says he's a lawyer. Says it's about an inheritance." Jack's hands stilled on the post hole digger, his heart suddenly loud in his chest. He'd been declared legally dead 2 years earlier, after 5 years of absence with no contact. It was part of Webb's plan, a way to close the file on Jack Morrison, to make him officially cease to exist so the watchers would move on to other concerns. But inheritance meant someone had died, and there were precious few people left in Jack's life who could leave him anything. The lawyer's voice on the phone was professional and distant. "Mr. Morrison, I've been trying to locate you for 8 months. I represent the estate of a client who passed away last fall. A Professor Marcus Webb. He left specific instructions that you be found and informed of certain provisions in his will." Jack's throat tightened. Webb had been more than an ally, more than a friend. He'd been the last living connection to his grandfather's world, the last person who knew the full truth of what Jack was protecting and why. Professor Webb established a trust, the lawyer continued. Funded partially by his own assets and partially by donations from an anonymous network of scientific colleagues. The trust has been purchasing parcels of land over the past 6 years. Specifically, it has acquired the property formerly known as Morrison Ranch and the property known as Brennan Ranch. As of 3 months ago, both properties were consolidated under the trust's ownership. You, Mr. Morrison, are listed as the sole beneficiary and trustee. The phone felt heavy in Jack's hand, impossibly heavy, as if it carried the weight of soil and stone across 1,000 miles. "I don't understand." Professor Webb's instructions were quite specific, the lawyer said. "The land is to be held in trust for scientific research purposes, with you maintaining full residential and operational rights. You cannot sell it, but you can live on it, work it, and decide who else may access it for research purposes. The trust also includes funds sufficient to cover property taxes and basic operational expenses for the next 20 years. Jack sat down hard on Catherine's porch steps, his legs suddenly unreliable. Webb had done it. Had quietly, methodically, over 7 years of careful maneuvering, bought back everything Jack had lost. Not just bought it back, but protected it in ways that made it untouchable by the corporate interests that had been hunting him. A scientific trust had legal protections, oversight, accountability. You couldn't simply make it disappear. "There's one more thing," the lawyer added. "Professor Webb left you a letter. I'm authorized to read it to you now, or send it to whatever address you provide. Read it, Jack said, his voice rough. The lawyer cleared his throat and began. Jack, if you're hearing this, then I've run out of time and you've hopefully run out of patience with exile. 7 years seemed sufficient for the dogs to lose your scent. The land is yours again, not through inheritance or purchase, but through protection and purpose. Your grandfather would tell you that land chooses its people. I'm telling you that sometimes people need to choose the land right back, need to commit to it even when ownership feels impossible. You did that. Now come home and finish what Thomas and Gerald started. Tell the truth they died protecting. The network is ready. We've been ready. We were just waiting for you to stop running and remember you're a Morrison. Morrisons don't run, they plant roots and wait for rain. It's time to plant, Jack. The soil remembers you. Catherine stood in the doorway behind him, a coffee mug in her hand and understanding in her eyes. Sounds like someone's calling you home, Jake. Or should I say Jack? He looked up at her, surprised. She smiled slightly. I knew who you were about 3 months after you showed up. I've got internet same as anyone, and missing persons reports eventually circulate. But you did good work, kept your head down, and never caused trouble. Figured you had your reasons for whatever you were running from. Sounds like maybe you found your reasons to go back. Jack stood, something shifting in his chest that had been frozen for 7 years. I've got to go to Texas. I know, Catherine said. You've been gone already in every way that matters, just took your body a while to catch up. Go on. Your last paycheck's inside, and there's a bonus. Consider it a going-home present. 3 days later, Jack crossed the Texas border driving a truck he'd purchased with Catherine's bonus and his 7 years of saved wages. It wasn't much, a decade-old Ford with high miles and a questionable transmission, but it was his, bought with money he'd earned under Montana sky. The landscape shifted as he drove south, mountains giving way to plains, plains giving way to the rolling hill country of his childhood. He reached Morrison Ranch at sunset, the timing unplanned but feeling inevitable. The property looked different and exactly the same, the way childhood places always do. The house had been painted, repairs made to the barn, new fencing installed along the main road. But the land itself, the contours and bones of it, remained unchanged. The creek still cut through the south pasture. The limestone outcrops still rose from the fields like the earth's memories breaking through. Jack parked where the old driveway met the house and sat for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of fire and gold. 7 years ago he'd buried his grandfather's secrets in this soil and walked away from everything he knew. Now he was back, not as the desperate man who'd lost his inheritance, but as something else. A keeper of truths. A voice for men who'd kept silent. He found the line shack by instinct, his feet remembering the path even in failing light. The stone building stood unchanged, patient as the land itself. Inside, dust motes danced in the last rays of sunlight filtering through the single window. His carved message on the door frame had weathered but remained legible, a promise he'd made to himself and the men who'd come before him. The next morning, Jack stood at the spot where he'd buried the metal containers 7 years earlier. He'd marked it only in memory, trusting the land to hold its position in his mind the way it held everything else, with quiet certainty. He dug carefully, respectfully, treating the soil like the archive it had become. The containers emerged intact, their contents protected by limestone and faith. Jack opened one and looked at the fragments inside, seeing them now with understanding he hadn't possessed 7 years ago. They weren't just proof of something extraordinary. They were his grandfather's legacy, Gerald Brennan's sacrifice, Webb's life work. They were the reason men had died and waited and kept faith across decades. Over the following weeks, Jack transformed Morrison Ranch into what Webb had envisioned. The old barn became a research facility, equipped with proper analytical instruments purchased through the trust. Scientists from Webb's network began arriving, men and women who'd risked careers to study what mainstream institutions wouldn't acknowledge. They worked quietly, methodically, building an evidence base that couldn't be dismissed or discredited. Jack found himself becoming something unexpected, not a rancher anymore, not quite a scientist, but a bridge between worlds. He maintained the land with the skills his grandfather had taught him, while providing access and support to researchers documenting truths that transcended agriculture. The ranch ran cattle again, but it also ran experiments in soil composition and electromagnetic phenomena. It grew hay and harvested data. It was working land and living laboratory both. The Brennan Ranch, 12 miles west, became the public face of what they were building. Jack converted Gerald Brennan's underground facility into a proper research station and small museum, documenting both men's lives and work. He told their stories with the honesty they deserved, not as conspiracy theorists or paranoid recluses, but as soldiers who'd encountered something extraordinary and spent their lives trying to understand it rather than fear it. The first major publication came 3 years after Jack's return, a peer-reviewed paper in a respected scientific journal analyzing material samples of unknown origin. It didn't claim extraterrestrial contact, just documented composition and properties that defied terrestrial explanation. The paper listed Thomas Morrison and Gerald Brennan as posthumous contributors, finally giving them credit for decades of careful documentation. More papers followed. Other researchers began publishing similar findings, work that had been suppressed or ignored for years suddenly finding platforms as the scientific consensus began to shift. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same patient persistence that had defined his grandfather's approach. Truth emerging like water from bedrock, slow but inevitable. Jack was 45 years old when he finally stood at his grandfather's grave, a simple marker in the Morrison family plot on the southern edge of the ranch, and spoke aloud words he'd carried silently for 14 years. "I understand now why you did it the way you did. Why you couldn't just tell me, couldn't just hand me the truth like an inheritance I wasn't ready to receive. You knew I had to lose everything first, had to learn patience and faith when nothing else remained. You knew the land would teach me what you couldn't." He paused, feeling the weight of years and understanding settling into his bones. The ranch is producing again. Not like before, but better in ways you'd appreciate. We're growing knowledge alongside cattle, truth alongside hay. People come here now to learn what you and Gerald protected. Your secret's not buried anymore, Grandpa. It's planted. And it's finally starting to grow. The wind moved through the grass, carrying scents of cedar and earth and the creek running over limestone. Jack stood in that wind and felt connected to something larger than individual lives or single lifetimes, connected to the continuum of men and women who'd worked this land and trusted it to remember their efforts. He thought about Gerald Brennan, alone in his fortress ranch, keeping faith with discoveries that isolated him from community. Thought about Professor Webb, sacrificing years and reputation to build networks that might outlive him. Thought about his own 7 years in Montana, learning that patience wasn't passive but active, wasn't giving up but holding on in ways that didn't show. The land had held what it was given. Had kept faith with seeds planted in soil and truth buried in stone. Now it was returning that faith, producing harvests that fed both body and mind, sustaining both life and understanding. Jack walked back to the ranch house as evening approached, his shadow stretching long across fields his grandfather had worked and his great-grandfather before him. The Morrison name was on the land again, but it meant something different now. Not ownership but stewardship. Not possession but responsibility. The land didn't belong to him any more than he belonged to it, they simply existed together, each keeping faith with the other's nature. Inside the house, his office held maps and research data, but also his grandfather's journal, preserved now in archival materials and scanned for researchers worldwide. The words Thomas Morrison had written in secret were studied openly now, his observations validated by instruments and analysis he never lived to see. That night, Jack stood on the porch where he'd stood as a boy, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, his grandfather had believed, were others watching back. Curious, perhaps helpful, certainly patient in ways that made human lifetimes seem like moments. Whether Thomas Morrison had been right about their intentions or nature didn't matter as much as he'd been right about the approach. You couldn't force understanding. You could only create conditions where it might grow. The land stretched out before him in the darkness, holding its memories and mysteries with equal grace. Fence lines his grandfather had built. Soil that had fed 3 generations of cattle. Stone that had protected secrets until the time came to reveal them. It was all still here, still producing, still teaching anyone patient enough to learn. Jack thought about legacy then, about what men left behind when their work was done. His grandfather hadn't left wealth or acclaim. He'd left questions and evidence, patience and faith. He'd left a grandson who'd lost everything and found, in that loss, the strength to protect something more valuable than property or pride. The ranch would continue after Jack, passing to others who'd hopefully understand what it meant to keep faith with land and truth both. The research would expand, the understanding deepen. But the heart of it, the lesson his grandfather had lived and Webb had honored and Jack had finally learned, that would remain constant. Some things couldn't be rushed. Some truths needed time to emerge, like water finding its way through stone or seeds splitting frozen ground in spring. Jack Morrison stood under the stars of his grandfather's sky, on the land of his grandfather's choosing, and felt the peace that comes from knowing your place in the continuum. He wasn't the beginning or the end of this story, just one chapter in a larger narrative the land itself was writing. Tomorrow he'd check cattle and host researchers. He'd mend fence and analyze data. He'd work the land the way his grandfather had taught him while advancing understanding his grandfather had dreamed of. The contradictions didn't contradict anymore. They complemented, creating something richer than either pursuit alone. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient light reaching across impossible distances to touch Texas soil. And on that soil, a man kept faith with those who'd come before and those who'd come after, doing the only work that really mattered, tending the land and trusting the truth to grow in its own time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.